It's about change. Change is perpetual. And there's so many different important aspects to change that we need to understand if we're going to change everything we do. And we're just about to. And so I think one of the aspects of change is always language. So another part I like to start off with when I'm speaking is ask people who can say hello in a different language. How many can say hello in Maori? Kia ora. Kia ora, we all know that one. Kia ora in Maori. How many can say hello in Noongar? Kei kora. Language is really important. Language actually grounds us in the place we're in. And we're coming through an interesting exercise in Western Australia where 30 years ago, if somebody stood up here and said, welcome to country, we would have thought, what were they smoking? What were they smoking? 20 years ago, we started to accept it in the 90s, and now it's just something we do. But it's really important because it actually ties us to place. Kei kora, wanju wanju nija Noongar Boodja. Welcome to the land of the Noongar. Let's celebrate that, because this is our language. We've come to live in this place, the land of the Noongar. Let's actually celebrate language, because as we learn to change our language, we learn to change how we think. Speaking language is really important, and how we communicate. So let's put it in there. And actually, as we think about what this next 10 years and this next 15 years is going to bring us, we really need to think about how we're going to change the language we use about what we do. And I'm really thrilled to see the NRM, Wheat.NRM, producing this dashboard and making you actually think about different icons and different... We relate really well to imagery. And that imagery then actually helps us, gets us in, and it gets us to think about the issues that are current to us. And I'll come back to the NRM dashboard in a later slide. What I want to talk to you about is change. What I want to talk to you about is what the future holds. And I guess what's happening globally with new tech that's going to impact us all, like Pokemon Go. And what do markets tell us about how soon those changes arrive? How do we understand that? Is this thing about to happen to us or not? You know, Ray Will stands up on this stage and says, oh, the whole world's going to be different in 10 years. Is he bullshitting us or not? We've got to think about how this change is going to impact on us. And we keep on hearing this phrase, disruptive technologies. And disruptive technologies is really a discussion of the 21st century. And I'll show you why it is such an important discussion in this century. Let's think about what we do in terms of planning infrastructure, how we regenerate rural Australia. How do we actually start to live that dream of the wide open agriculture and all the other dreams that we've had here today? Absolutely brilliant speakers today. Hopefully I can join them at the end of this process. What does this mean for future farms, future businesses, and what do these renewed farms and regions and cities, what do they look like by 2040? How do we actually map this change? And of course, taking the futurist caveat that it's really difficult to predict anything, and especially if it's about the future. And that's meant to be funny. It's okay, you can laugh. There'll be a few jokes through. I don't know if you'll get more, but you know, I'm going to laugh, and I don't know if that's a good thing. Economics 101 tells us about how we adopt technology in our economies. And I've probably got a little red pointer thing here. There's two graphs there. The bell curve tells us, over here, the bell curve tells us the moves we go through in terms of early innovators and early adopters and how we adopt technology. And when we're going into a marketplace, the yellow line up there tells us that the market itself is absorbing that technology. Now, when you've got 100% market penetration, it doesn't mean every one of you in the audience has got one. Not every one of you is playing Pokemon Go. But when we've got to 100% saturation, then that tells us that we've all adopted that bell curve, and that's as far as we're going to go. Although some of you should start playing Pokemon Go. I'll show you why later. And so we can actually understand that part of the market and how it actually gets absorbed in. And we know that because for 100 years we've been buying stuff. And we've been measuring how we've been buying stuff. And when we measure how we've been buying stuff, we understand how it's been taken up in the community, or in the economy, or in the business sector, or whatever we've taken. And when we buy stuff, we also get rid of stuff. So we actually also go through an exercise of discarding the old, swapping the typewriter for the computer, swapping the old flip phone for the iPhone. Hang on, who's still got a flip phone? Come on, hands up. Here's a couple, okay. Well, okay, yeah. Well, we'll have to address that later. So, but there's always an exit as well as an entry on anything that we do. So here's a wonderful shopping list. You can look down this and pick your favourite topic. and work out how there have been windows of opportunity for a technology to exist, and then it's gone, and a new technology has replaced it. And down that shopping list, we've gone from buggy whips to electric vehicles back in the 1900s, and then we went on to combustion engines, and now we're moving back to electric vehicles, but these ones are going to be self-driving. So the world is absolutely changing in a funny way. Probably the best example of technology that most of us would be familiar with is videos, which is about halfway down that list there. So there's two aspects to that. I'll try and point around that flag there. There's two aspects to it. And one is that, first of all, when we were adopting videos back in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, there was VHS and their beta. And VHS was the stuff that we all used. But the technologists would have told you that beta was the best technology. So when we went to video, we didn't go to the best technology, we just went to the one that was open source. It wasn't called that in those days, it wasn't proprietary. It was open source, and it was cheaper. And so that's what the masses went for. And all the TV stations use beta. But if you were a Joe Public and you bought one of those beta machines and you went to the video library, you had about one shelf of videos you could choose from because all of them were VHS. And sometimes when we're talking about this sort of technology, people ask me, Ray, what's the renewable energy that's going to be the most successful ever on the planet? And the very best answer I can give is one of them. One of them will be successful. And you know what? It doesn't really matter because everything gets replaced, and whatever's successful will be replaced by another thing. Because VHS and beta got replaced by DVD. And then that's been replaced by Blu-ray. And now it's being replaced by the cloud if you're managing to get anything on an NBN network that's close to you. I haven't got one either, it's all right. But we actually only have windows of opportunity for the technologies we're using, so we need to actually think about how that comes to replace. There's another example down that list, which is one that I know a little bit about, is energy. Energy too has gone through an evolution. We went through gathering wood as cavemen or women, onto chopping wood when we invented iron and steel axes, and then onto coal because we noticed there's this rock in the ground that could burn. And then we started to build and do different things and skip a bit of time, and we've moved on to wind. And then in renewables, we're now moving on to solar. Last year we built more solar farms than we built wind farms in capacity. We're actually already taking a choice about which technology is going to be the biggest one, at least for now. And, that's an interesting graph. I've lost one of the slides in doing my editing last night. I haven't checked this bit. What you're meant to be able to see behind that graph on mobile phones is a whole pile of technologies. And at one end is the 19th century, the other end is our 21st century. And what you'll see is that over time, if you just look at the lines, which I've mostly hidden, apologies for that, you'll find that in the early 1900s, it took 40 or 50 years for technologies to get to that saturation point, to get to that penetration. And in the 80s, we got to things like TV sets and video recorders, and it took about 15 to 20 years for them to reach full penetration. And then into our century, into this 21st century, it now takes only about 10 years for that technology to be adopted. And there's a graph of the 10 years of the mobile phone, so you'll actually see the lines open up in a minute when I do that. If we actually want to see how quickly mobile phones have been adopted, we've got to compress that curve into a tiny little part of that graph. And you can see how steep it is compared to the lines that were there earlier in the century. And so it's kind of like waves stacking up and crashing on a beach. These waves are getting steeper and steeper all the time. Things are happening faster. It's not just us getting older thinking they're getting faster, they really are getting faster. And so as a consequence, in the 21st century, we need a new way of thinking about the way that technology gets adopted. And this is a graph by a consulting group called Accenture, and they came up with the Big Bang Theory, or the shark fin. Nice graphic phrases for what it looks like. But basically it compresses that grey part of the old Rogers S-curve that we talked about before. It compresses that all into a few years, because that's what's happening. We're measuring it. It's real. It's not somebody thinking, maybe the future will look like the shark fin. The future is the shark fin because we're already seeing it. And we can go back in time and we can look at any sort of data in any sort of market that will tell us how these technologies get adopted. So this is not just, a hypothesis or a hypothesis supported by data which then becomes a theory. This is actually what we're measuring. And what we see is that the S-curve exists. Sometimes the S-curve is not quite as steep if things aren't as popular, like with power mirrors, which are an expensive option to add to your motor car. And other times the keyless entry thing, or gee, we all wanted one of those little gizmos so we can get in the car without touching the door, that sort of stuff. That was really popular, so it got taken up really quickly. But nevertheless, they both had an S-curve. And when you look at the bottom part, where you look at either fuel injection engines or multi-valve engines, fuel injection went really quickly, multi-valve a little less so. Sometimes that's because we as consumers decide we want the fuel injection engine and we want to beat that black car off at the lights. And other times, the manufacturer makes the decision for us. Makes a decision to say, well, if we're going to build a motor car and we're going to put an engine in, we're going to use fuel injection. So on that list there, if you go to the bottom, which are the first movers on fuel injection, you can see Mercedes, who invented it, and then GM went to Munich a few years later and they invented it too. But actually, when you see the third one from the bottom is BMW. Within a couple of heartbeats, BMW had said all of our engines are going to be fuel injection. They made a decision about what their customers could buy from them. They didn't have that diverse choice. They thought this is the best solution for us, that's what we're going to execute. So sometimes we get to make decisions about power windows and power mirrors and whether we want them, and then sometimes the supplier just makes a decision on our behalf. And there's another group that makes a decision on our behalf. Now, if you quickly read this graph, then you'll know what the answer to this question is, but I'm going to ask you the question because I don't think you've read the graph yet. And the answer is if government gets involved, six scariest words in the human history, I'm here from government, I'm here to help. If government gets involved, that wasn't meant to be a joke, it's okay, I haven't offended anybody. If government gets involved, do markets go faster or do they go slower? If government's involved in a market, who thinks they go slower? Markets go slower if governments are involved always. Yeah, we know that. Who thinks markets go faster when governments get involved? You've read the graph, well done. Because when governments get involved in a marketplace, it goes faster. How is that possible? On the board there you can see the adoption rate or the maximum growth rate along the bottom for motor cars of a technology that's graphed out there. And it says from 2% up to 20%, 2% up to 20%. Average age of the car fleet's 11.6 years. That's a really hard number for doing maths with, so let's just call it 10. Average age of the car fleet is 10 years. If you've got a 2% adoption rate in a 10-year market average, that's a 50-year adoption rate. It takes 50 years for that thing to get in and adopted. If you've got a 20% adoption rate in a 10-year market, that's a 5-year adoption rate. It takes 5 years for the technology to, didn't change the graph, that was good, to be adopted. So, down in the blue bars, which is a non-regulated market, that is where government aren't playing, it's taken 50 years for us to adopt a certain technology into motor cars. What is that technology? It's a centre console. Not all cars still have centre consoles. But up the other end, in the red, we have two bars up here. One's at 20%, 5-year adoption rate, and the other one's about 22%, which is quite a remarkable speed of 4 years. Now, what could that be, do you think? What would governments say that we have to have in our cars to be adopted that quickly? Seat belts is a good one, that's the lower one, 20%.
Fuel emissions?
Emissions is in there, but it's actually in the mid-range. The answer is airbags, in the news today. Another recall from Toyota. Airbags. Governments decided that airbags will save lives and said that we're going to have an adoption rate of airbags of 5 years. Now, who would like their airbag to deploy in 5 milliseconds rather than 5 years? It'd be much better if it came out quickly. But governments also understand that when they actually go and regulate a market and force change and make that market go faster, they also understand that people have to adapt to that, making it go faster. So what they said to the factories is that within 5 years, all motor cars must have airbags. And so suddenly, after 5 years, all new motor cars had airbags. So when governments enter a market for a regulatory purpose, they can make that market go faster. That's good news for us if we can influence our politicians to make the changes that we want, or vice versa. It's always difficult looking forward in time, because at the end of the day we're mortal, and we don't get to look forward in time. So when we're standing there looking at this cliff face that's coming towards us, which is this unending rate of change that I'm now talking about, it doesn't look like that for us. It can only look like this. So that's the best we can do. So we have to actually be able to understand some of the parameters that are going to help us understand how this pace of change will impact us. And you can start to look at really complex graphs like this one. There's a challenge when the future is changing quickly, because if you've been in the industry for 30 years and you've got 30 years of data, which is the red line on that graph, then your view of the future is the future's not going to change very fast. because I've got 30 years of data. And I've been around here doing this forever, and how would you know, you young whippersnapper, you've come up here and you reckon everything's going to change in 2 years? It's just not possible, because it hasn't changed in 30. So our perspective on how things change start to influence the decisions that we make about how we are going to allow things to change or not. And sometimes even a short amount of data doesn't actually help you that much, because if we've got the yellow line there, even with a couple of years of data, we're still actually biasing our estimate of how quickly things can change to a below estimate. And if it's below what we're expecting and we don't prepare for rapid change, then we're going to be caught short when that rapid change descends on us. So it's a really important element to think about. And when we start to think about the rapid change we're seeing in this century, as a scientist, I'd prefer to have 50 years, 100 years of data. But in terms of this topic, in terms of rates of change, that amount of data will simply confuse me. I've got to be able to actually think about the now and think about how the now's been impacted by that data. And whatever happens, if I introduce something new, there will always be an exit. So let's look at some examples of that. PV pricing and solar panels is a really good example of how the world is getting turned on its head. This graph says that the little red box there says 22% price reduction for each doubling of cumulative volume. That's basically an economic paradigm for that. If you build a factory and out of that factory you then double your production rate, you should reduce your production cost by about 22%. So the more you produce, the cheaper things should get, and that's called a learning curve. You get more efficient, you get your material supply chain modified, you get this rate of production going on. And even when that red line showing the PV fall is happening, you can see there was a bubble in the silicon market up here, the price went up, but the price of solar panels kept going down because we're producing more and more of them. And that just created a learning curve opportunity that reduced the price of things. And in fact, what we now know is that that was a slightly older graph. That learning curve ratio is somewhere between 12 and up to about 28 or 29% usually. And 22% is about the industry norm. If you're getting a 12% learning curve, it's going slow, and if you're above 22%, like solar actually happens to be now at 26%, it's going extraordinarily fast. 26% price reduction in a solar panel every year. Wow. Okay, so what does that look like? What it makes it look like is this. When you change a market that quickly, this is what disruptive technology looks like. When you change a market that quickly, you bring the price of solar down from being somewhat extraordinary at that level down to a price where it's actually now, in 2014, it became cheaper than coal and gas and oil. In 2014, it became cheaper than coal and gas and oil. Nobody in the coal and gas and oil industry believed that for a minute. They said, oh, that's bunkum. Well, actually, in 2016, it's even cheaper again. While coal and gas and oil hasn't really changed all that much. It's been trading in that sort of 60 to 100 range. We've been down to 40, but we're back in the 40 to 50 range now. And you'd think with this new technology that is disrupting, that has got this pricing advantage coming with it, you'd think that this is a really exciting time to be in the renewable energy industry, because when you look at this growth chart for wind, cumulative in the world, and solar, cumulative in the world, there's some pretty exciting growth charts. I wouldn't mind having shares in that sucker. But actually, we've only just got started. This is only just the beginning. Have we, when we look at this graph and we see wind kind of leaving the asymptote back in the late 90s, thinking, well, that must be when wind succeeded. And we've got solar, when Germany started building, leaving that asymptote back in the mid-2000s. Try not to point the laser into somebody's eyes over there. And you think, well, that looks pretty exciting. But actually, if you look at what new future potential growth is, and you go to this graph, then wind really only got going about the mid-2000s. And solar only got going in about 2011, 2012. It's only just started to happen. So it's really pretty exciting, because this renewable energy revolution that we're sure that we're already on the coattails of actually hasn't really got going yet. We haven't seen anything yet in terms of change that it will bring to our markets. And then if we actually push that out into even longer term forecasts, we can see even more rapid change. And probably the thing to note there is that, like everything else, if it's a bit older, it's gone slower, and if it's a bit newer, it's gone faster. So wind was fast, but actually solar was faster. And when batteries arrive in the next 2 years, they'll be extraordinarily fast. They're just going to break every land speed record for the adoption rate of technology in the history of man, apart from maybe the wheel. And with every entry, there's an exit. We've actually been seeing an exit of coal, although the coal industry doesn't accept my heretical view, but we've been seeing an exit of coal since 2011. This is the Stowe Global Coal Index, 1,500 companies around the world measured as an index. And what we know from that data is that coal is down 98% of its value in 4 years. 98% of its value in 4 years. If your superannuation funds have been invested in coal, you've done your dub. You've done your dough. And at the same time, we're actually seeing forecasts which are suggesting that we really should be seeing an exit. Now, this is my forecast, and my expectation is that coal will be starting to heavily exit the market within about 8 years. And then we'll see other exits starting to happen with gas and oil at a later point. Why is it happening? Because all of these new technologies we're creating them faster and faster, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper, and they're doing things that the traditional energy market has not expected. So we're actually seeing this change, and you can see here the changes in grid-scale batteries coming down, but not yet started to accelerate, in my view. We've seen the other things like solar PV in yellow, and even LED lighting getting really cheap in the last couple of years. It's changing extraordinarily the way we think about technology. Now, again, just using solar as an example of here, is every technology will get replaced. Now, maybe by similar technology, new solar might replace old solar, but when we actually think about what solar is, this first part is solar solar cells are those little sort of squares that you see inside a big solar module. You assemble those solar cells into a module. So we've gone through first and second generation solar, just as the same way we're up to generation 7 of an iPhone. But both of those things get assembled to become a solar panel. They're fixed on. So we build a house, we put a roof on, and then we go up with a special guy called a solar installer, and they put solar panels on the top. And that's actually 2 lots of labour. We put the roof on with the roof plumber, and then we put the solar up with the solar installer, and we had to pay 2 lots of people to go up on the roof. And that's generation 1 solar. Generation 2 solar looks a bit like this. When we build a roof, we actually only send up 1 person. And we put roof tiles on that can capture solar, and we put other roof tiles on that don't. We actually just reduce the number of roof tiles we needed. And we also reduce the amount of labour we needed. This is what happens when you actually start to establish a learning curve into a product that changes the way the product's applied. So this is generation 2, and this is just really starting to emerge now into the marketplace. Generation 3 of solar, though, gets even more exciting, because it's when we weave solar fabric, when we actually have materials that use solar in different ways, and that can look like something like that. It can be see-through. Solar film. Now, this solar film is in production at the moment in Spain, and while we're building around 50,000 megawatts of solar a year, we're going to do 10 megawatts of this one this year. So it's brand new in the market. It won't really be emerging until maybe 21, 22. But it's see-through. Solar panels are black. So what's happening here? Well, when you make a solar panel and it's black, it captures all the light that falls on it: infrared, visible spectrum, and ultraviolet. When you make a see-through window out of a solar film, then it just captures infrared and ultraviolet, and it lets the visible light go through, so it can't capture as much energy, so it's less efficient than a black solar panel. But actually, on some windows, especially the ones on the outside of the building, we often put on a tinting, and its job is to take out the infrared and the ultraviolet. So we're already paying to tint the window. So what if we can produce that tinting that can, at the same time, not just reflect the ultraviolet and the infrared, but capture it and use it as energy? And what if that film cost the same amount as it did originally just to tint the window? If we can do that, then the electricity that comes off of that panel is free. It didn't cost us anything, because we're already tinting the window. What would economists do with free something? What if everything was free? We wouldn't have an economy, would we? What if everything was free, we wouldn't have an inflation rate? If everything was free and we didn't have an inflation rate, we wouldn't have a reserve bank to up our interest rates. So economists are going to have a very difficult time with the concept of things being free, like energy. And that's what the 3rd generation of renewables will start to bring. And it'll bring some turmoil with it as we actually adjust to that. Alongside that free, though, is that, generating electricity might get free, but we're still going to have to do things like store it. We're going to have batteries, and they're going to cost money. Batteries aren't going to come for free. So we've got to think about how that market's going to change and how that's going to impact on just about everything we do. And Elon Musk, you've probably heard about the guy from Tesla who's building these electric cars, and earlier this year he sold 400,000 vehicles in 10 days of a car that hadn't even been built yet. Actually, we hadn't even seen the final design. People put down deposits on something that wasn't even finished out of the design phase. Remarkable. And he announced last year, in May last year, he said, in 2020 I'm going to build a factory, and it'll be called a gigafactory, and put out all these batteries. And then a bit later last year he said, actually I might build it by 2019. And then last year, end of last year, he said, yeah, I think it'll be up and running by 2018. And at the moment, currently factored for quarter 3, 2017. How often do you hear of projects not moving backwards but moving forwards? It doesn't happen much, or at least it didn't. But in the 21st century, we're going to expect that projects arrive earlier, not later, because everything will be faster, including our rates of construction. How can you globally change a market? How can governments make a market move faster? These little brown dots on the map of Japan, which you can't see the map of Japan anymore, are electric car charging stations. There are now 40,000 electric car charging stations in Japan, which is more than they have petrol stations. Took them 18 months. When a government steps into a market and decides we are going to change, it can change quickly. And so my own view is that's going to reflect in a whole range of change, that this is just a graph of my view of how both home storage and car storage will change over time. But let's bring it back to us. Let's bring it back and think about what we can see here. Last century was command and control. It's a phrase you may have heard before. Command and control. You had a central power station that produced power for everybody in the region. Or you had a central printing press that produced a newspaper for everybody in the region. Or you had a central bank that decided what banking policy would be. The 21st century is changing all that, and this century is going to be about suggest and choose. Suggest and choose, because of this little device here, means that we can have what we want, where we want, and when we want it, if only we can order it. If we're connected to the internet, we can have anything delivered by coffee pods. If we're connected to the internet, we can actually order tomatoes from Wide Open Agriculture and have them delivered to Singapore. So suggest and choose brings the markets to us and allows us to control the sorts of things that we're developing there. And it's already happening for renewable energy, as I've described, but it's also happening in things called e-retail, and this is a great one, market-led marketing. Market-led marketing is where we decide what we want to buy. Now, you might be confused to think that last century we did decide what we're going to buy. No, what we bought was what the manufacturer said we could have. But this century is about the crowd and the cloud. This century is about campaigns like Kickstarter, which throw up an idea onto a web page and say, who'd like one of these? And if nobody responds, they don't build it. But if we all respond, then they build it. That's market-led marketing, where the market decides what products it wants to be built for it so it can buy them. It's an extraordinary change in the way we manufacture stuff and the way we conceive ideas and deliver it to us as consumers. This is going to cover a whole range of things. A big long shopping list here, the everything, the Internet of Things, built by sensors and things that are going to be fundamentally important to the way we do agriculture and run regional businesses. And alongside that, with this plethora of technology that's descending on us, things like automation and hybrid automation, where automation is where you get a machine to lick a stamp and it licks the stamp and puts the stamp on, it goes away, you don't interact with it. Hybrid automation is where you've got a machine that's maybe assembling a car and you occasionally have to lift a part up into the right place. And then we get to artificial intelligence and contextual intelligence, AI and CI, which are different intelligence systems that allow humans not to be involved at all. All of the process is controlled by robotics. And then we start to get into this phrase of robility, this idea that robots are starting to help us move about the place. And we're seeing that with autonomous cars and so on. We're seeing this all roll out. Then we get to this other stuff called 3D printing, which is the idea that you can, how many people know what Star Trek is? Show of hands. Everybody, come on, most people actually. And in Star Trek you get the tricorder out. I call it an iPhone, but it's really just a tricorder. This is the thing that tells me everything I need to know about the planet I'm standing on. It's a tricorder. And then if I want a cup of coffee, I'll walk over to the replicator. And I say, coffee hot with milk. And suddenly you open the door and there's a coffee hot with milk in a cup. It's actually a big 3D printer. 3D printer version 00.1 that we're working with here, and the Star Trek one's about, version 27. But it's just a 3D printer, that's all it is. And we're seeing these technologies come to us at a time when computing and connectivity and Bluetooth and all these other things that connect devices are coming at the same time that computer chips are being embedded in everything that we use. So that this collision of technologies is creating change across every sector, including in the energy. And ultimately, I think the biggest threat to us right at the moment, in my view, is the next 3 years for the financial industry. The fintech bust will be coming. If you've not seen the movie The Big Short, have a look at it. Great movie, funny movie, quirky movie, but it tells you what happened to cause the GFC. So my view is the GFC will be small compared to when the financial institutions start to get hit over the next 3 to 4 years as a consequence of changing technology. Suggest and Choose is changing it. Crowdfunding, where you can now go online to a business called Society One based out of Sydney and do what's called a peer-to-peer loan. You can take a loan from somebody else. You don't have the banks involved. Society One takes a small clip on the way through, but your loan is with somebody else. Society One secures your loan. It's a secure loan, but it's done through crowdfunding. It's a very different process. And this is the driver, this connectivity that we've got through social media and through other devices. And we're seeing that evolve too into this sort of market of self-driving cars. This is my growth rate for electric vehicles. This is my growth rate for self-driving cars by 2025. My view is that by 2025, the world will only sell electric vehicles, with maybe some exception of some specialist vehicles that still use combustion. But by 2025, in 9 years' time, the only thing I think we'll be manufacturing will be electric. And if that's true, then they're also lend themselves to self-driving cars, and then this other category of fully self-driving cars where there's no steering wheel, there's no braking system. You just jump in, you go for a ride, you get out the other end. The RAC bus in town is an example of that in Perth at the moment. And why will it happen faster than anybody's expecting? Because governments will get involved. When they see companies breach emission standards, they'll start to put down regulations to say, you guys haven't been behaving well enough, we clearly need to intervene here, and we'll see governments drive markets faster, not slower. And then we'll see that collision of technologies as well. This is a 3D printed car. The whole thing. The windscreen, 3D printed. The lights, 3D printed. The wheels, the steering column, 3D printed. The engine, the alloy engine, 3D printed. This is a car that was created at the beginning of 2015. It exists. The final assembly was done by hand, but ultimately the final assembly will be done in a factory with robots. And that thing will be far, far cheaper than any motor vehicle we've ever had, and be far, far safer than any. This is the roadability side, this idea that cars will be self-driving. And they have an enormous array of sensors in them, all of them taking information, and all of them being far more alert than we could ever be. And the crash of Tesla that some people may have read about earlier this year has some people have said, well, that's going to put autonomous cars back 5 years. No, it won't. It'll make it go faster because of the competition in there. And then we can think, well, how does this apply to our farm? And the answer is suggest and choose. Smaller, faster, quicker. So we'll actually start to move away from large vehicles back to smaller vehicles that are self-powered, self-autonomous, and you simply program in to your farm calendar, next Tuesday week is seeding day, and the robots will just go out and do it for you. And if you have to spray, then they'll go out and they won't spray the whole paddock for weeds. They'll go through with an imaging system, and will have seen, many of you have seen these already. They'll go through an imaging system and use 2% of the chemical that they did before. So you won't need a big machine because you won't be carrying as much chemical. So there's a whole range of twists that are coming in this space as well. Guy in the middle here is Campbell Newman. This is all based out of Queensland, this stuff. But actually it's not just based out of Queensland because it's happening everywhere. We're seeing smart farms emerge. We're seeing the Internet of Things for sensors that tell us what the water, what soil moisture is doing, what soil carbon is doing, what the temperature is doing, which way the wind's blowing, how much energy you've got left in your battery system of your robot vehicle. And it's doing all these things as we see robots that are solar powered with a battery system that don't need to go back to be charged, moving slowly because they're not consuming much energy doing what they're doing, and with drones flying through the air, sensing systems. And then with this one, not only wide open agriculture, but tiny weenie agriculture. Tiny weenie agriculture in vertical gardens vertical gardens that are growing lettuces, and so on. So it's a really exciting time of change where that intensive agriculture is becoming affordable because we can 3D print the frames on site, we can build these things on site. And so when we start thinking about how does that impact our NRM strategy, and what do we do to think about, what do we do about moisture and soil moisture, and what does that mean for broad-scale agriculture, then wide open agriculture may be solving some of that. We may do less wide open agriculture in a broad acre sense, and more wide open agriculture in the consolidated sense. And we think about how that then impacts on carbon soil development, and how important that is for healthy crops in wheat fields and barley fields and lupin fields. And we can think about how that then also interacts with a whole range of other things like salinity. And then finally, most importantly, because at the end of the day, it's not a farm, it's a business. And if it's not making a profit, you don't have a farm. So we actually have to think about how that returns on our investment in a sustainable way that means that we don't lose the farm when we plant the next crop. How do we know all these things are changing? Because we can measure it. How do we know that, say, renewables has changed? This is comparing TV sets, which are big black things like that, to solar panels, which are big black things like that. So equivalent solar panel to TV sets. And if you compare that, then last year we actually built, for the first time in the history of the planet, more solar panels than TV sets. We've commoditised it. It's actually arrived. Last year was, in my view, 2015 was the year of renewables, because from this point forward, it will always be renewable from here on in. And that happens right across the world, and it happens within Australia. Australia's taken some interesting journeys. There you can see a plot of wind in blue and the solar in red, and you can see that, or yellow there, you can see that wind grew slowly, solar grew faster, and when batteries arrive, just with my global forecast, batteries will go faster again. Just to conclude, there's a couple of little slides I want to do on a project that I'm now involved in Cunderdin with my business called Sunbrilliance. And we've announced Australia's largest generating solar farm to be built in Cunderdin. 100 megawatts of solar, $160 million project. It's going to happen on the Creswick Farm property, which we purchased earlier this year. And we're going to break a whole pile of rules about how we get finance. We've already done that. We're getting the finance at the moment. We're breaking a whole pile of rules about how we sell the energy. We're using what's called a market approach, where we simply sell it to the market. We don't look for a PPA, we don't look for a contract of supply, we simply sell it to the market. And so in that sense, we're not shutting anybody else's capacity, we're taking it. And if we roughly dress up the farm, this is just a mock-up, that's kind of, we're occupying the whole farm with solar. Or are we? There's a nice little bit in the middle that I've got particularly excited about. I think a few other people will when I show you this. The Central Farm Precinct is about 8 hectares, got a lot of history. Creswick was an early founding farm, and there's a nice 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom farm on it now, farmhouse on it now that is about 10 or 15 years old. But next to it, on the right, is the old homestead. It was built in the 50s, in disrepair, nice round verandas. And then just to the south, next to this olive grove, is a little grey 2-room home of cement construction that was a 1930s original settler's cottage. And then there's a bucket load of farm sheds on the place. So when I first saw this farm, we were looking to just build a solar farm. We weren't thinking of a visitor centre. I thought, gee, there's some history here. And there's a whole range of issues, like the olive grove itself is being impacted by salinity. There's a bit of a bare patch down there. So what can we do about that? Maybe we can put in some solar groundwater pumping so that we pump out that salty water. But if we take the salty water out of the ground, where does it go? Not into the stream, that'd be bad. So we started thinking about what we can do on this 8 hectares within the middle of the farm. And we're going to build a Margaret River style visitor centre and cafe, using the old homestead as the cafe, and a new 3-storey visitor centre with a rooftop viewing platform over the farm, but the bottom 2 stories being a gallery of arts and crafts, of local produce, of gimmicks that might be related to renewables, but actually more about what's related to the wheat belt. And if we're going to pump that water out of the ground, then we need a desal plant on site. So stage 2 includes us putting in a desal plant to take the water out and bottle up some maybe Cunderdin solar spring water. And then actually, but we'll have more water than we need because we won't drink that much water. So we'll throw in some new wetlands, some freshwater wetlands that haven't existed in the area for over 100 years. And then we'll add in some vertical greenhouses to start growing food. And then actually we've got all these solar panels here, and I've still got sheep yards. That's because when you put solar onto your paddock, you still graze the same number of sheep, 10 per hectare. So we'll continue to graze this as Broadacre. It will still be a farm. And we'll still have a shearing shed, which might have some solar and batteries on it, so you can understand you don't actually need to connect the grid to keep your shearers going in springtime. And then we've got to think about, well, what can we do with the rows between the solar panels? Can we actually do something different? Instead of just grazing it, maybe we can plant in some lemongrass and water it with some of our fresh water and actually start to produce a higher value crop. Maybe we'll throw in lavender and start selling lavender bulbs. I don't know. We've got a big long wish list that we're looking at the moment, but we're just planning how we actually evolve this precinct to be a function centre with a big area for weddings and parties and everything. Folks in Cunderden tell me that if they get married, sometimes they go to Merredin. Anybody from Merredin here today? Sometimes they go to Merredin. Mostly they go to Perth. Occasionally they go to Bali. But they don't get married in Cunderden. We're going to change that by actually creating a visitor centre that shows people how we can change things. This stuff's not going to be big enough to be commercial or to compete with wide open agriculture. But it will be a demonstration of what you can all do on your own farms as we deploy this stuff, not just tomorrow, but over the next 5 and 10 years. Start to integrate what's called a blue economy approach to integrating all the outputs. We've got an olive farm that we want those olive trees to stop being impacted by salinity, so we'll actually recover the water, as I said, but we'll also slow motion film the olive trees and watch their recovery. And maybe there'll be some jars of olives in the visitor centre that we can sell soaking in a bit of brine out of Cunderden from the salinity plant. Look, lots more to talk about there. We've got a big long wish list for that. We're about to start some community consultation on the visitor centre itself in November. More on that later. There's some really interesting issues that crop up here. Last couple of slides. First one is that there's a lot said about coal being good for humanity. Coal is good for humanity. We've heard that before. When you actually start to take and solve energy poverty, you don't turn up one day with a power line and everybody then suddenly owns a fridge and a telly, because they're still poor. The way to relieve energy poverty is to take the poverty away. So you start that in stages. So when you actually go into a hut like this and you try and study at night, if you introduce a battery-powered solar lamp and costs you $8, and it replaces a kerosene lamp that you used to spend $2 US a week on to get fuel for, and over a year's time, $104 US to buy kerosene for a lamp that didn't actually put in any adequate light and put pollutants into the cabin. This particular light lets the student study. It relieves them of the burden of kerosene, and it starts to relieve poverty. That's the integration that renewables can bring. And I guess the core here, and why is this relevant to us today? Because we don't know what we're going to do with this stuff yet. But up here, this lady bought herself a 50-watt panel, and you can see chalked on the wall, phone charging, 200 shillings. She created an enterprise out of this new technology that nobody had thought of before. Phone charging, 200 shillings. It's about 40 cents Australian in Kenyan shillings. And I guess the point is that it's pretty difficult to bring coal-fired power to your village on a donkey, but you can do it with solar. And in remote locations where your farm sheds are, where you're previously bringing a genset to, you can actually have solar just sitting there waiting to use it when you need it. Or you can bring in a portable system that will do the same. Last slide. This one really sort of tries to describe some of the really massive changes that happened in the last 10 years. It's a shopping list. You might have seen some of this shopping list before. The most famous one is that Uber is a taxi company that owns no taxis. It's simply a relationship where Uber take a clip, perhaps an overly generous clip, but a clip on the way through of the owner of the vehicle. But actually, if you look at everything else, Airbnb doesn't own any properties as a hotel chain. Telcos that don't own wires like Skype and WeChat. And you can go down that list. And the commonality of all of these new businesses in this century and in this decade is that they don't own assets. They simply exchange money for services. And that's what this century is about, exchanging money for services. Now, if you're going to do that, will the world's largest energy company even generate any energy? Or will we be doing it on our rooftops and selling it off to the grid? And then will agriculture sector go assetless? You know, what will agriculture own in this new model? I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be different to what it is now. There's no doubt about it. But the key here is the battlefield is this slick consumer interface. How do you handle the information and how do you develop customer loyalty? Because at the end of the day, what all these businesses have done has actually been better for the customer. And the customer's been loyal or been willing to use it because the interface has allowed them to access their system. So if we're going to sell coffee pods, we need to make sure that our ability to order those coffee pods is easier than the ones from Nescafe. Slick consumer interface, slick consumer customer relations. That's me done. I think I've probably gone over time, but I hope that's been useful.
When will energy be transferred through non-wires?
So there's already experiments doing that already, where we can do wireless recharging, but it can only be done at very low volumes. So at the moment, it is possible to recharge, say, a low energy cell phone via a wireless network, because wireless means transferring energy. When will we do it on a larger scale? Only when, and this is the interesting part, only when our devices become more efficient. The less energy the device uses, the more able we are to wirelessly recharge it. But as long as they're energy hogs, we've got to plug it in. Okay, one more from the back.
One more?
Is there a place in the future for people like me who refuse to subscribe to social media?
No.